Should my life be spent here because of the choice that I've made for the rest of my life? No. Like I said, I did deserve to be, isolated, as they would say. But the idea of isolation is for me to reflect on myself and to become a different person, which I know I have become.
These racist laws that got us shook, we need to have a second look. These racist laws that got us shook, we need to have a second look.
So my name is Jolene Russ. My partner is Brian Russ. He's been in prison 21 going on 22 years. We've been asking for clemency for Brian Russ because Brian's accomplishments while in prison are profound. They're substantial, but also because it's the only option we have to relieve our family of this excessively heavy and burdensome sentence. Brian was sentenced to consecutive sentences of 49 years. His conditional release date isn't until 2034. Brian needs a second look. Our family deserves for Brian to have the opportunity of a second look. And New York needs the Second Look Act.
We will leave the rest of our loved ones in these prison cells to drown.
Since 2016, Jolene has dedicated herself to advocating for her husband Brian Russ's freedom, while fighting to give people in prison like her husband a legal pathway to have their lengthy sentences reconsidered.
Look at people for who they are today and not who they were on the worst days of their life.
Brian and I's journey is epic. He was like my crush forever. So he has always been kind of that measuring stick that I measured my love to.
Jolene grew up in a rural suburb outside Albany. She remembers racing ATVs with her stepdad while her mom ran a local bar. 200 miles away in Geneva, Brian grew up teaching his brothers and nephews how to swim in the Finger Lakes while his mom worked for Greyhound buses. Their story together begins in the summer of '97.
My romance for him started when I was 15, when I met him. We met like happenstance. We were both at a campground.
When we were just sitting there talking, and the more we talked to each other, the more we're realizing that we got all kinds of similarities.
The teens grew up in volatile households, suffering abuse from the hands of those closest to them. Both were just trying to survive, but felt comfort and vulnerability with one another. After that night, the pair went their separate ways, but managed to stay in touch.
How are you, honey?
He was so good for that, for like calling right back. And that was back in like the 90s. I used to like star 69, all the numbers that he would call from. But that's ended up being how I ended up finding out that he got arrested. Because when I had called to say, hey, like, come to my graduation party, come to my graduation, like I was inviting him to all that, his brother told me, he's in jail. I was like, well, I'll just wait. When he comes home, I'll have him. He's like, Jolene, I think you're going to be waiting a while. And that was May 25th, 2000.
Even as a teenager, Jolene was no stranger to the justice system. She saw her brother, her parents, the guys she dated, her friends, and nearly her whole generation criminalized. So Brian's bad record was never a shock. But what she didn't realize at the time was just how serious and life-altering Brian's path of criminal activity had become.
Growing up, I'm gonna say this, stability is everything for identity. Like you have to have stability, you have to have a place to live and say this is home. So us growing up, we didn't really have that in the beginning. Now the things I remember about this trailer, it was really infested with roaches, right? And you might sit there and step somewhere and you might sit there and say, oh my God, this carpet is so plush. And then realize it's not a carpet, it's just a whole bunch of roaches bedded together. And then from there, I remember going to Cherry Street. The oddest thing about it is that we're a poor black family with a white mother trying to live amongst middle-class white people. And they really, really hated us. And the Burnettis, one time I was playing football, catch football on his driveway with his son, and he comes out the house and you get your black ass out of my driveway. But he didn't say black, he said the N-word, you know?
Brian and his siblings saw the back of cop cars before they saw the first grade. And when he wasn't running from the cops, Brian was running from an abusive father.
I got so many scars from him just hitting me with certain things or throwing me somewhere, and he'll do it with so much impunity, like he just didn't care. Even when I told him that I was being sexually molested, he called me a liar. You know, mind you, this is when I was 9 years old. If I can't find safety and security in my own home, I'm not getting in the neighborhood because the neighbors hate us. I'm not getting at school because the teachers don't like us. Where else am I gonna get it? You could tell a kid, hey, you know, stealing is wrong, right? And me, I'm, yeah, you're right. As long as I'm like being fulfilled in a way to where I don't have to steal, then I'm never gonna steal. But if you tell me, hey, stealing is wrong, and I'm like, yeah, but then I go in the kitchen and open the refrigerator, it's empty. I go in the cupboard, it's empty. I'm hungry, I'm starving, right? It's not because I want to be morally wrong or break the law, but I'm hungry.
In Brian's eyes, a childhood of poverty, abuse, and discrimination led him down a path of bad decisions. By 23, Brian had already been arrested for burglary, trespassing, possession of stolen property, and 3 counts of assault. At 24, Brian came up with a plan he thought was foolproof.
So the idea was to rob drug dealers, put the drugs into the prison system. In my eyes, we're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Nobody cares about drug dealers, and nobody cares about people in prison. That was the idea.
One night in March of 2000, Brian and a group of friends decided they would rob a drug dealer's house in Newark.
He's telling us it's a drug house. He keeps saying it's a drug house, it's a known drug house. While we're sitting outside, I'm trying to think of ways of like thwarting this robbery. I didn't want to do it because of the machete. And the first thing that was red flag for me, and I know it was for my other co-defendants, is that a female answered. You don't really expect a female to answer our door at a drug house. We asked her, where's the drugs at? And she says, there's no drugs here. So she went to go shut the door, and we pushed our way through. One of my co-defendants took her into the kitchen, and as soon as I came through the door, I noticed there was pictures on the wall, there's so much furniture in this. I said, this can't be a drug house. Like, somebody's actually living here. Now she's crying hysterically. We go to the kitchen, and my co-defendant's taping her up with industry tape. And she's crying, saying, I don't want to die, I can't breathe.
Brian and his co-defendants fled the home before police arrived, leaving their victims taped up on the kitchen floor. Two months later, Brian wanted to throw a big Memorial Day party but didn't have the funds. Looking for a quick fix, he decided to rob another drug dealer. But once again, the robbery did not go according to plan.
So I said, man, look, man, if you're not gonna come up with the money, man, you're gonna have to walk home. This is my mentality, like, you're gonna walk home. I'm not thinking about hurting this guy at all. And next thing you know, the guys I was with started punching him. So Sincere gets frightened, he jumps up. And I shot him, right in his leg. I shot him in his leg.
After the shooting, the victim ran from the car and called the police. This was Brian's last night of freedom. Investigators tied Brian to both crimes. As he awaited 2 trials, Brian and his lawyers attempted to negotiate a plea deal. Brian was offered no plea deal for the shooting and attempted robbery in Ontario County, forcing him to trial. The Wayne County judge offered Brian a plea deal of 5 years for the home invasion, but part of that deal stipulated that the 5 years would be added on top of whatever sentence he received in Ontario County.
I had no idea what was gonna happen. So I told my lawyer, I said, tell the DA I'll take the plea as long as it's concurrent. But my lawyer came back and says that the consecutive offer is non-negotiable. So the DA knew I was already guilty if I'm willing to take the plea. I didn't want to go to trial. I didn't want to get 5 years either, but that 5 years consecutive it threw me off.
Instead of taking the plea deal, Brian decided to go to trial in both cases in the hope that he could convince the judge to reduce his sentences. But his worst fears were realized. Both judges handed Brian the maximum sentence, 24.5 years, each to be served one after the other, meaning he was sentenced to a total of 49 years. A sentence harsher than some convicted murderers receive. After Brian went to prison, he and Jolene lost contact. But, in what they can only describe as fate, the two happened to cross paths at Auburn Correctional Facility.
And she wound up getting married to somebody that winds up being one of my best friends while in Auburn, right? And she comes on the trailer, and I'm sitting there, we're both looking like, we gotta know each other. I gave this book to her ex-husband. It's a book of parables.
I used to read it all the time, and like it was always these connections and things that would make me think about Brian. So I used to write him, like hard times would come and I would write him, or birthdays or events would come, I would send him cards, and we came together and I sent him a letter, and it was, the rest is history really from there. Like it just all kind of fell together.
How Jolene and I wound up getting married is the greatest question ever. Because I still ask every time I look at her, I'm saying, I cannot believe she's sitting in front of me and visiting me.
I mean, we've normalized it now because it's been 22 years. But like in the beginning, I was told by everybody, like all my family, all my friends, everyone that knows me, like how crazy I am to go through all this. Like, why would you put yourself through all this? Why would you do this? Why would you do that? Why would you stand in line in the freezing cold for hours? Why would you wake up at midnight and leave your house at 3 a.m.? Like, but those are the, like they always equated it to like, why would you do all that for a man in prison? Like, regardless, like people do things for being in a relationship, you know, like you make sacrifices, whatever. But like, I don't equate it as Brian has me doing all this. Like, prison has me doing all this. This is the systems and structures that are in place to deter visitors and dismantle families and destroy communities. Like, I don't look at it like, knowing that, it makes it feel like, it almost makes it feel like an act of rebellion. Like over that way where there's like a bunch of little windows, I think that's one of the cell blocks. That might be A block.
Jolene doesn't excuse the fact that Brian committed heinous crimes. However, she believes that the crime does not fit the time, and that Brian should not serve the remainder of his virtual life sentence because of his substantial efforts to focus his life in a new direction. And Jolene will tell her husband's story to anyone willing to listen.
My name is Brian Ross Sr. I'm currently incarcerated at the University of Building, and the visitors are not.
While he did the crimes, 49 years is not a sentence that's anything that looks like justice for the crimes that he committed. I will assert that he got that amount of time because he's a black man in a predominantly white county. He went to prison needing an adjustment. He got that adjustment. But 40 years, he don't need that long to serve it out. What he spends his time doing now is facilitating programs. Everything he's learned in the last 22 years, he's teaching it to someone else. Someone that's probably gonna come home and do better in their community because he asked them and he inspired them to start now.
I would say it was probably the time as soon as I got in the cop car, it was the handcuffs. As soon as I got the handcuffs on me, it was like, oh, okay, this is it. It's either now or never.
Brian and Jolene say he's used his time in prison productively and responsibly, becoming a mentor to others in prison while trying to give back to the community he once harmed. According to prison records, Brian has received no violent infractions during his time incarcerated. After excelling in various anti-violence programs, he now teaches them 4 days a week. He has earned certifications and licenses for a number of jobs to ensure his success on the outside, and is currently working to obtain his paralegal license. Using his own commissary funds, Brian and Jolene also coordinate an annual backpack giveaway. Brian buys 30 backpacks and fills them with school supplies for Jolene to distribute to low-income children in Brian's hometown.
I know a lot of people think that coming to prison is just the worst thing ever, but to me, I feel like it helped me realize who I wanted to become. I'm not saying prison reformed me. I had to do it myself. Prison just gave me the momentum to sit back and say, I'm gonna be a different person. I'm not gonna be that same person. And that's what I mean by prison helped me as equal as it hurt me.
While Brian focuses on making positive change inside prison, Jolene spends her time searching for ways to give her husband and other marginalized folk a chance at justice.
Hey, honey, here we are. I miss you so much. Those are the steps that go up to the hearing room we were in. We got rushed out of there a little bit because they were ready to start the next one, but I'm excited for the rest of the day. I miss you. I was 12 years old when the '94 crime bill passed. I saw my entire generation criminalized right down to sagging our pants. The group of Puerto Rican friends I grew up with, the way that they were treated so much differently than me. Like, I became an advocate in middle school and high school, like trying to get my friends out of trouble because where I was getting detention, they were getting expelled. So like, I kind of feel like it started back then. It just never made any sense to me. So like very, very young, I was always trying to make sense of the word justice, and it still doesn't make sense to me. And then even when people say that justice has been served, it doesn't feel like anything just or right or fair to me a lot of times.
In New York, there is only one mechanism for people in prison to have any review of their sentence: clemency. This, however, is not a viable solution for most families. Only the governor has the power to grant clemency.
So she can see there, and she can see the Justice Building. So she's right above us. Maybe she's looking down. Hey, Hochul, how are you, girl? Sign the clemency.
And according to New York State's comptroller, release or sentence reduction through clemency has a 0.2% success rate. But this did not stop the Russes from giving it a shot, as many of Brian's supporters believe he is well deserving. One of these supporters is former public defender Steve Zeidman, who runs the Clemency Project at CUNY Law School's Criminal Defense Clinic.
Brian wrote a really compelling letter requesting help. And what really kind of caught my eye is the majority of people that we work with are serving time for very violent crime. In Brian's case, when I saw the number, the 40 years that he was serving, originally sentenced to 50, and then in his letter he wrote that he'd been convicted of robberies, the sentence immediately caught my attention as being just completely disproportionate, out of line, and inappropriate. So I wrote back to Brian.
Professor Zeidman decided he would take on Brian's case pro bono and help the Russ family create a convincing clemency application.
You're supposed to do 40 years, but whoa, look at these achievements. Look at the apology letters. Look at the letters of support. Look at all you've developed, facilitated, created, mentored. It's time to reduce your sentence. That's what clemency should be about, but it's just not being used. It just, for the most part, that power gathers dust. So to me, looking at what governors have done, not just in New York, but across the country, Brian would seem like a perfect candidate. Again, nobody was killed. He's already served a number of years. His so-called institutional record is terrific. He's got a solid reentry plan. It would seem like a pretty easy, low-risk clemency application to be granted. Why it hasn't happened? Again, lack of political will, lack of courage. The governor's saying, what do I gain when I grant clemency? How does that help me politically, as opposed to, is it just the right thing to do? Going to the state prisons in New York, you just see a parade of black and brown men and women. And that's who populates the New York State prisons, overwhelmingly, disproportionately. You know, is that accidental? You just have to be the most naive human being in the world to believe that.
Clemency announcements come around Christmas time, but Jolene has yet to receive that one irreplaceable gift: her husband, home for the holidays. For the majority of people in prison, receiving clemency is as realistic as winning the lottery. And after 5 years of applying, the Russ family has never even received an acknowledgement of their application. So, Jolene and other criminal justice reform advocates decided to pave a new path to freedom, fighting to change sentencing laws and demanding that lawmakers refocus the justice system around mercy and rehabilitation. She joined the grassroots organization, Communities Not Cages.
But we're here to fight for communities, not cages.
Right.
And families that have been impacted by mass incarceration, and to overhaul New York's racist and draconian sentencing laws. From the 1970s Rockefeller drug laws to the 1990s so-called tough-on-crime laws, New York built a sentencing regime that funneled hundreds and thousands of people into cages. And as intended, these laws exacerbated the mass criminalization and mass incarceration of black and brown New Yorkers. And again, I say, that ain't right.
So I want you to repeat after me, 30,000. 30,000. That is the amount of individuals incarcerated in the state of New York. Come on. Somebody say 75%. 75%. That is the amount of people that are incarcerated that look like me and that look like you. Somebody say 70,000. 70,000. That is how much this state spends per person per year to cage. Damn shame.
These are the solutions. This bill package is the solutions to all these racist systems and structures that have been built against us.
Fall of 2021, Communities Not Cages introduced a package of 3 bills intended to reverse generations of damage caused by New York's harsh sentencing practices. One being the Second Look Act.
The second look resentencing will give people like Brian the opportunity to be heard and seen.
It would allow anyone to go back before a resentencing judge, different than the original judge that they've seen, and have anything that they deem pertinent reviewed. So if that person thinks it's important that their either physical, emotional, sexual, psychological abuse when they're a child is important to be considered because it wasn't in the original sentencing, that can be reviewed. A person's rehabilitative path since they've been in prison, that gets reviewed. A person's institutional adjustment and behavior while in prison, that gets reviewed. It's not necessarily a decarceration bill. It will get some people out of jail, but it's not going to be like a mass exodus. The way the courts run is slow. So some people will come home, but they'll be deserving people.
Second Look bills gain momentum, with legislation passed in 4 states and proposed in another 22. Senator Cory Booker is also working toward passing Second Look legislation at the federal level. As the chair of New York Senate's Crime Victims Crime and Corrections Committee, Senator Salazar focuses on making jail and prison a last resort for addressing crime. She sees Second Look legislation as a natural first step toward achieving this goal.
In the past 2 decades, we in New York have not changed sentencing laws or created a mechanism for people like Brian, of which there are thousands in our state who are in prison right now, to have their sentence reconsidered.
Politicians like Senator Salazar say that keeping reform prisoners like Brian behind bars is not a smart policy and actually decreases public safety.
It really would be beneficial to not only incarcerated individuals, but to our society and to our state, to allow people to have their sentences reconsidered and potentially reduce the prison population through that means, so that resources can be better spent in ways that actually benefit public safety and also make our system operate more effectively.
In the next 12 years, New York will spend close to $1 million to keep Brian behind bars, money that Jolene believes could be better spent.
My kid can't get special education past the 4th grade because the school doesn't have funding for it. But you're building his jail cell off his IEP. Make it make sense. So defund the police while everyone's ganging up on it and saying, oh, it's not the right idea, we can't speak on it, we can't use that don't use it as your slogan. But put the money in something that's going to produce different outcomes and not in policing your people.
Following the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, thousands of Americans took to the streets, demanding an end to mass incarceration, a reevaluation of policing, and for cities to defund police departments. Supporters of the Second Look felt this momentum was the wind at their back. But just as quickly as the protesters went home, the winds once again shifted, as police departments around the country reported a dramatic increase in crime since 2019, especially in New York. Newly inaugurated Mayor Adams was launched into the center of a national debate around policing, gun violence, and public safety.
We will not surrender our city to the violent few.
Mayor Adams has pledged to return to the tough-on-crime policies of the 1980s, having officers target minor crimes, increasing police presence, and reinstating plainclothes officers. Many on the right argue that recent reforms like new bail laws could be to blame for this uptick in crime.
2 years ago, Democratic lawmakers here passed bail reform, which requires judges release defendants before trial for all but the most serious crimes. Supporters say it promotes alternatives to incarceration for people who can't afford bail. But police say it's leading to a surge in crime.
How bad is crime in New York right now?
Terrible.
Could you elaborate?
It's absolutely terrible, and we saw it not only here, we've seen it in Portland, we've seen it in Newark, New Jersey, we've seen it in California. Everyone watches New York City. If they can get away with it or fix it here, they're going to get away with it or fix it somewhere else.
You know, we need more of this. We need more of the voices. You can't be the silent majority anymore.
Joe is an NYPD sergeant and founder of Blue Lives Matter, a non-for-profit organization created to help raise awareness for the needs of law enforcement. He stands behind our justice system, putting the safety of New York citizens above all else.
Cops don't go out there and say, Central, tell me what color that victim and that perpetrator are. No, we rush to a scene to help whoever's calling. And to sit there and have Cuomo and Hochul sit there and try to make excuses, try to have activists, try to have people like Cory Booker go out there and try to say, well, where are the numbers? The numbers don't show that bail reform is a negative. It's nothing but negative. All these individuals that are being let out of jail are going out there and reoffending. And not once, and even with the bills they're trying to pass, why don't we have a bill for families? Families that lost a loved one, not just police officers, but the victims. Where's their second chance? You know, we have individuals, and yes, you know, I think people should be really evaluated, and over time, maybe they can reinvent themselves, but it's just like a person that drives drunk. If they do it once, they're going to do it again. It's just the way it is.
Due to an order of protection by the court, the Russes have not been able to contact any of Brian's victims. But according to a poll of 800 violent crime victims done by the Alliance for Safety and Justice in 2015, 61% of these victims say they prefer their assailants have shorter prison sentences, and that states spend more on prevention and rehabilitation programs as opposed to sentences that keep people in prison as long as possible. 60% of victims also said they preferred that the system focus on rehabilitation instead of punishment.
Sometimes people do ask me, like, if you had an opportunity to change that day, what would you change about it? Me, I wouldn't change that day. I would go back further to figure out why the hell am I there in the first place? You know, that's what I want to change. That's what I firmly believe I did since I've been incarcerated. I'm never gonna find myself on that path again, you know? Because I know my alternatives now. I didn't know my alternatives then, even though the only alternative I needed to do was just leave.
No matter the circumstances, Jolene and her family will continue to fight for Brian's release. Because they know that true justice would mean seeing this father, grandfather, husband, brother, uncle where he is needed, home with his family. Especially as the family continues to grow, with Brian III born just a few days ago. Jolene tries to stay strong, but when her daughter accompanies her on a visit, emotions run high.
To see them two hug is just so precious. Like, they hug for so long, you know? And she hasn't seen him since summertime when we could hug. I would just miss that part of today. I just really missed seeing them being able to hug and just share that. Because I know she needs that from him. The system is just too cruel sometimes.
This prison stuff is what is between us. But between me and her, there's nothing. Love, affection, care, support, protectiveness. Like, this is what's between us. This is what we focus on. These are our stepping stones over all this stuff. We don't give this no attention. It's there, yeah. This is real. Don't let it fool nobody. It is real. But what's between me and Jolene isn't prison. It's just us and what we decide to make. Once we become entrapped with that, who knows? But right now, we're not trapped.
I hate leaving him there. So like, typically my entire ride home is like trying to figure out a new spiel or a new way to appeal to people, either about Second Look or parole justice or the whole Communities Not Cages package, or about clemency. You know, it's constantly on my mind in there, and just trying to figure out how to say the right thing or get to the right person to hear us. People need to understand that punishment isn't the only option. Prison is no place to grow old and raise kids. And you wonder, like, the amount of stress and strain we go through all this time, all of these decades. When we finally do get out of here, are we going to be well enough to enjoy what we have left of life? How much freedom will we be able to even have together? And that's one of those things that haunts me.
New York needs a second look!